Hello, friends. Today we're answering the question, should you eat poultry, chicken and turkey? Before we begin, I have a brief announcement to make. Hello, friends. Thanks for joining me for another report. If you like what you see here, I think you'll really enjoy a program I'm offering starting next month. In this program, you will become expert in knowing what foods to eat for optimal health and longevity. Through an online curriculum and one-on-one sessions with me, we'll put together a plan replete with delicious and easy-to-prepare recipes for you to consistently follow the healthiest diet imaginable. This program is designed for busy professionals like you. Please check it out. The link is below. We're going to answer that question using the best evidence published to date on that question. This study was published in JAMA Internal Medicine in February 2020. JAMA has an impact factor of 44.4, meaning the average article in this publication is cited 44.4 times every 2 years in the medical literature. This is one of the highest impact factors of a medical journal, giving us confidence in the study's findings. The study was a cohort study that pooled 6 prospective cohort studies. Cohort meaning that they just followed people. They didn't assign them to eat poultry or not eat poultry. They just followed them as they made their own diet decisions. And then asked the question, what is the effect of poultry consumption on incident cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality? They also looked at the question of what's the effect of red meat, processed meat, and fish on incident cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality. But today we're just focusing on poultry. I will focus on those other topics in subsequent episodes. The first thing to point out is that poultry consumption in the U.S. has increased during the period 1999 to 2016. At the same time, red meat consumption has decreased. This is likely due to the public attention brought on red meat for its health risks and poultry as seen as a safe alternative. Nevertheless, the association between cardiovascular disease and poultry consumption is uncertain. It's not clearly beneficial or harmful according to the medical literature up until this trial. So let me show you this graph, which better illustrates what I'm talking about. This is from a meta-analysis done in the journal Circulation in 2016. So they looked at a bunch of foods and looked at any associated risk with cardiovascular disease. For white meat, which they defined as poultry or rabbit, they found 5 prospective cohort studies that examined whether or not cardiovascular disease death was affected by poultry consumption. They looked at over 1 million adults and they measured the amount of poultry consumed, and they determined for every 1 serving per day increase in poultry consumption, there was a 1.0 hazard ratio for cardiovascular disease death, which basically means that there was absolutely no difference in cardiovascular disease death as poultry consumption increased. So up until our study today, the evidence pointed to absolutely no benefit or harm from poultry. Taking a closer look at our study, as we said, it's a cohort study that pooled together 6 prospective cohort studies. They looked at 29,682 U.S. adults following for a median period of 19 years and up to 30 years. They looked at about everything you can look at in this population. They looked at diet, they looked at demographic factors, they looked at clinical risk factors, and they looked at consumption of poultry at baseline, among other foods. And then they looked at incident cardiovascular disease. That was defined as whether or not during the follow-up period individuals had a coronary heart disease event or not, a heart attack, that was fatal or not, whether they had a stroke or heart failure or any form of cardiovascular disease death. They looked at all-cause mortality as well, and they adjusted for multiple covariates, which we will get to in a second. I'm going to present these results across 7 slides. The first is to point out that the average adult in the study consumed 2 4-ounce servings of poultry per week. This table shows the baseline characteristics of the population. If we look at the poultry consumption, we see that for the total population, the median consumption per week was 2 servings per week, which is actually less than I would have expected. The next slide is meant to illustrate confounding variables. We always assume that, well, people who eat chicken, they also exercise more and they don't smoke and they have a healthier diet, and that's why we see the outcome we see. And if you were to guess that, you'd be absolutely right. The researchers looked at covariates. So looking at poultry consumption, they determined partial correlation coefficients, which means if you have a positive correlation coefficient, it means that the 2 variables are associated with each other. If you have a negative coefficient, they're inversely associated. So if you look at poultry consumers, they are less likely to eat processed meat. That's a negative correlation coefficient. They are more likely to eat fish. They are more likely to have an overall higher dietary index score, which is an overall measure of diet quality. They are less likely to smoke. They are less likely to drink. They are more likely to be physically active. So you can see going into this that there's a little bit of untangling we're going to need to do, because eating poultry goes along with a couple of other positive behaviors, and you're less likely to do bad things if you eat poultry. We're looking at 2 outcomes in this study: incident cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality. We're going to look at the results of the study in 3 representations of the data. The first gives us an idea of the overall association between increasing poultry consumption, cardiovascular disease, and mortality. Let's look at that closely. Here we are focused on poultry intake and the risk of incident cardiovascular disease. This is not to give you a quantified but more qualitative assessment. As poultry consumption increased, the risk of incident cardiovascular disease also increased. You can see that this 1.1 hazard ratio would be a 10% increase. So to give us a first pass at the data, we have an impression that incident cardiovascular disease increases with poultry intake. Furthermore, we can look impressionistically at all-cause mortality. As poultry consumption increased, it looks like the hazard ratio remains around 1, or even goes down a little bit as poultry consumption increases. And certainly if you look at the 95% confidence interval, or the range of values for which we're confident, it definitely crosses 1. There's definitely not a clear effect on all-cause mortality. We've looked at an impressionistic view of the data. Poultry clearly increases cardiovascular risk as you increase poultry intake, has no effect on all-cause mortality. Now let's look at hazard ratios. Hazard ratios tell us the relative difference between the groups. We'll look at it for cardiovascular disease, and we'll look at it for all-cause mortality. First, we'll look at that hazard ratio for cardiovascular disease. Let me explain these models. So the models adjust for covariates. We said that people who eat poultry are probably the kinds of people who don't smoke, who don't eat red meat, who have a general healthier diet, who are physically active, and we were right about that. Well, the researchers controlled for those variables. The more variables they controlled for, the higher the models. So model 3 controlled for everything from their education to their ethnicity, their smoking status, their diet, and their physical activity. So we have more confidence when we adjust for more covariates that we're actually looking at the effect of poultry rather than something else. And what this shows is a 1.04 hazard ratio for every 2 serving increase per week of poultry, meaning for every 2 more servings of poultry you ate, there was a 4% increased risk of cardiovascular disease. The confidence interval doesn't cross 1, and the p-value is less than 0.05. So we can have confidence at this point that there's an increased risk of cardiovascular disease for people who eat poultry. What about all-cause mortality? Here we are looking at risk of all-cause mortality, and we can see by Model 3, the one that's the most adjusted, the one we like the best, least question of bias, there is a 0.99 hazard ratio of all-cause mortality, which means that there's a 1% lower risk of death for people who, for each additional 2 servings of poultry consumed. However, the confidence interval crosses 1, and the p-value is greater than 0.05. So we can have no confidence that the results, that the groups are actually different. So far, we can say that the hazard ratio for incident cardiovascular disease is greater for poultry consumers, but the risk of death is unchanged regardless of poultry consumption. Finally, we're going to look at the 30-year attributable risk difference, which is not the relative risk between the 2 groups, but it's the absolute risk of getting cardiovascular disease or dying. And we can see that for the absolute risk difference for people who consume poultry when followed for 30 years is for each 2 serving increase in poultry consumed, there was a 1.03 absolute risk increase for incident cardiovascular disease, and when we're talking about absolute risk differences in percent, we don't want the value to cross 0. That would indicate no difference. This value does not cross 0, so the result is significant. When we look at all-cause mortality, we can see that there's a decrease by 0.28% in all-cause mortality for each 2 servings of poultry consumed per week. But the percent crosses 0, which means that we can't have certainty that the results, that the groups are actually different. Where we are at this point is that when we look at the 30-year absolute risk difference, there's an increased risk of incident cardiovascular disease, but no effect on all-cause mortality. The takeaway from this study is that consuming poultry increases cardiovascular disease risk, but it has no effect on all-cause mortality, and that's after adjusting for multiple covariates. The researchers hypothesized that the harm that came from poultry in terms of cardiovascular disease risk could be due to fried chicken, that there is already proven in the literature to be harm from fried foods. And in this study, the researchers were not able to identify how the chicken was prepared. Let me just show you the prior literature on fried food. This was a study in the British Medical Journal, and they showed that for consumption of fried chicken, there was an increasing risk of all-cause mortality as fried chicken consumption increased. So perhaps the harm that's been shown in terms of cardiovascular disease is due to people frying chicken. So what can we take away from this study? Well, personally, I will only modify my lifestyle when there's an effect on all-cause mortality for the variable. Poultry consumption has no effect on all-cause mortality, so I will continue to eat poultry. However, I'm a little more curious about the effect of poultry on my health after reading this study. Up until this point, there was absolutely no clear association with poultry intake and cardiovascular disease risk. Now there probably is, but it's a little bit unclear exactly what's causing that increased risk. So I'll continue to eat poultry, but keep my eyes open for future research on this topic. Thank you for your time and attention. I really appreciate it. Have a great day.